everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and there was no Formula One race this weekend, which means that today we don't have a race recap. But I wanted to use today to talk about something that's pretty important to me, and I think if you're listening to this podcast and have watched my content, is probably pretty important to you too. Today we're going to be talking about the history of women in Formula One. Now, I think there is a common misconception that women can't participate in Formula One, or if you do know that women are allowed to participate in Formula One, you don't realize that there are women who have done so before. Formula One is unique when it comes to elite sports because there is no gender separation as you move up the pro ranks. This is actually pretty common in a lot of motorsports. IndyCar is the same way, sports car racing. There are a lot of opportunities across the motorsports world to watch mixed grid racing. And there have been more successful women in other series such as sports car racing and NASCAR. And as of right now, women have been a bit more successful in getting into those racing seats in other motorsports series. But when it comes to Formula One, women are allowed to take one of those top 20 seats. So when we look at motorsports and Formula One in particular, it's not the way we would see other sports like the NBA and the WNBA being separated by gender. If a woman were to make it up the ranks of Formula One, get the super license points that she needed, and convince a team and sponsors to take her on, women are allowed to take one of those 20 seats on the grid. But something I think people don't often realize is that women have already participated in Formula One. There have been a total of 5 women in history that have entered Formula One Grand Prix. So today we're going to walk through some of those women and their stories, talk about the original 2 trailblazers who came in very early in Formula One and paved the way for the rest, the 3 other women that came after them and have participated in Formula One, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about the women that have come in between that final entrance all the way up to the state of women in Formula One racing today and what the future might look like. I also think when we talk about the historical women who have entered Grand Prix, a number of times we see them just kind of reduced to a headline about their career. So I want to take you a little bit more in depth because I think the context of what these women did was not only really impressive, but also gives you a little bit more of an idea of what it was like to race when they were there and what the differences are and the challenges are that we're seeing in a modern Formula One world. So to start, you should know that the first Formula One World Championship took place in 1950. It took 8 years until 1958 before we saw a woman enter a Grand Prix. But as we dive into the context about this, I want to remind you that a number of things have changed about Formula One since the 50s. One, Formula One has become a lot safer and more reliable sport to participate in. If you look back into historical Grand Prix, you will see a number of people do not finish races just due to engine failure. Mechanical issues often caused retirement, and crashes were a lot worse than they are these days. So as we put that into context, we should remember that Formula One in the 1950s was a much more dangerous and unreliable sport. But in 1958, 8 years after the start of the Formula One World Championship, Maria Teresa de Filippis became the first woman to enter a Formula One Grand Prix. Now, the thing about Maria is that obviously it's so cool to be able to say she was the first woman who ever entered a Formula One Grand Prix. But what's even cooler about this is that Maria started her racing career because her brothers basically dared her to. Maria's father was an automotive engineer, and her brothers had been racing around her while she was growing up. So she already had an interest just by association in the world of racing. And when her brothers basically dared her to, Maria started racing in 1948. She was only 22 years old when she started, and she continued to enter into a number of minor Italian racing series. In 1954, she took second in the Italian Drivers' Championship. And the only reason she didn't take first was because she was involved in a very terrible racing accident which actually caused her to lose hearing in her left ear. Again, I want to remind you how dangerous car racing was at the time. But Maria did not allow that type of injury or accident to keep her off the track. In 1958, she became the first woman to enter a Formula One Grand Prix, and that was in Monaco. Now, one of the things that you're always going to see attached to her name is the fact that she failed to qualify for her race. But something we should put into context with that is that race structure was not the same as we know it now. We're very accustomed to this system of 10 teams on the grid with 20 drivers total, a race weekend where everyone sets a qualifying time and 20 drivers hit the racetrack. That is not the way that Formula One worked in 1958. In fact, 31 drivers attempted to qualify for the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix, and only half of those drivers actually set times that allowed them to drive. In addition to Maria not qualifying, a very familiar name was among those who didn't. Bernie Ecclestone, who eventually became the president of Formula One. So I want to bring that into context because a lot of times we throw around these stats when we say that women don't fit in Formula One or that they can't compete at the same highest level. One that is often thrown around is the fact that women didn't qualify for their races or that women didn't score points. However, in 1958, only the top 5 finishers as well as the driver with the fastest lap scored points at all. So to put that into context, at the last Formula One race in Monza, if they were operating under the same scoring system that Maria was in 1958, Max Verstappen, George Russell, Checo Perez, Alex Albon, and Kevin Magnussen would not have scored any points last week. After she entered the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix, Maria continued to compete in Formula One. She entered and completed the 1958 Belgian Grand Prix, which again, the completed stat is a big deal because of how often these cars were failing to complete a race at all due to technical difficulties. And she would have entered the 1958 French Grand Prix, however, she was not allowed to compete. However, in 2006, Maria revealed that the race director told her why she wouldn't be allowed to compete, and that was because the only helmet a woman should wear is at the hairdressers. So yeah, not exactly a skill issue there. Maria entered 2 more Grand Prix in 1958, one in Portugal and one at Monza, and both of those were retirements due to engine failure. And Maria's final entrance in a Formula One Grand Prix was in 1959 at Monaco. There she competed with Porsche and did fail to qualify. Though again, for context, there were a total of 8 drivers who entered the Monaco Grand Prix and failed to qualify, and the other 7 were men. Maria ultimately retired from racing in 1959. But again, this wasn't because of a skill issue or a desire to race. Tragically, in 1959 at the German Grand Prix, her team leader and friend Jean Barra passed away in a sports car racing incident. This was in a support car race in the German Grand Prix, and after witnessing the crash, Maria was devastated and ultimately decided to retire from racing. So that's Maria. She's the very first woman to enter a Formula One Grand Prix, and up until I did my own research, I found that I was only hearing about her as the first woman to enter a Grand Prix and how many times she failed to qualify and never scored any points. But I hope this gives you a little bit of context, because a lot of people were failing to qualify for Grand Prix at that time, and the rest of them were men. It had nothing to do with her abilities as a racer because she was a woman. It had everything to do with the fact that cars were much less reliable at the time, much less safe, and the qualifying and point scoring system were very different than they are today. After Maria retired in 1959, we didn't see another woman enter a Formula One Grand Prix until 1974. Lella Lombardi is the driver that most people have heard of before. She was an Italian driver, and she is the woman who has entered the most Grand Prix, and to this day is the only woman to have ever scored points in Formula One. Lella entered 17 races, qualified and started in 12, and as I said, is still the only woman to have scored points in Formula One to this day. And outside of Formula One, Lella also had some pretty big groundbreaking things. She was the first woman to qualify for the Race of Champions, and outside of Formula One, she continued to race in sports cars and endurance racing. Lella Lombardi's path to Formula One was a lot more similar to what we're used to today. Lombardi's very first job was actually as a delivery driver for her father's butcher shop. From there, she also started karting, then moved on to Formula Monza, and finally Formula 3. In 1974, she entered her very first Formula One Grand Prix, and there, like Maria, she failed to qualify. But in 1975, Lombardi was approached by Count Vittorio, and he ultimately sponsored her entrance into the 1975 championship. She raced the full season for the March Engineering team, at that time underneath a Lavazza coffee brand sponsorship, and at the 1975 South Africa Grand Prix, she became the second woman to qualify for a Formula One race. Now, the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix is where Lella scored that historic point. Lombardi also has this weird stat of only scoring half a point in a season, and that's because the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix had a very tragic incident where one of the cars crashed into the stands and 5 spectators were killed. Because of this, Grand Prix was ended early, places were taken at that point, and all of the points awarded were actually halved. At that time, the scoring system for Formula One was that only the top 6 drivers, as well as the driver with the fastest lap, received points for a Grand Prix, and so Lella, having finished 6th, received half a point. And again, to put that into context, if we were still using that same scoring system in Formula One, at the last Grand Prix in Monza, Max Verstappen would have scored the same amount of points that Lella Lombardi did. It's hard, I think, to put those things into context and compare them, because racing was obviously very different at the time. Formula One has worked so hard since then to make this sport so much safer, and it's hard to remember that when you're talking about these women who actually put their life on the line to do this. This was a sport where when you got in the car, there was a real chance that this was the last thing that you would do. And that's still the case today. There is still an extreme risk in racing in Formula One, but I do think it's important to put into context how much more dangerous it was at the time due to the fact that there just weren't this same level of safety regulations put into place. Lella raced in 1976 for the same team, but after finishing 14th in the Brazilian Grand Prix, the team dropped her, and she moved over to Ram Racing, where her top finish was 12th at the Austrian Grand Prix. Lombardi left Formula One in 1976, but she didn't stop racing. She continued to race in sports cars, and she even raced in a NASCAR race in 1977, and she continued to be a race car driver all the way through 1988. After she retired in 1988, in 1989, she actually formed her own racing team, Lombardi Autosport. So when I look at Maria and I look at Lella, I consider them the trailblazers for women in this sport. They were the first women who took the risk to enter and continue to pursue that career in racing, even when ridiculous things were happening, like this racing director who said you can't drive because women should be at the hairdressers, and also to be aware of this extreme danger and to continue racing. These two women being a part of this sport gave us an opportunity to say women have been able to do it for almost as long as men have. And when you put it into the context and you look at how many men were not qualifying for Grand Prix, how many men didn't score points while they were racing in Formula One, and to this day, how different the scoring system is, how different the actual qualifying format is. These women, when you actually put it into context, had much more impressive careers than I think we give them credit for, because I think we have a little bit of a recency bias. We forget that Formula One didn't always race the same way that it does now, that teams weren't set in the same way that they are, that there were more drivers that were entering Grand Prix than there are today, and of course that cars were just breaking down left and right. So not finishing races and not scoring points doesn't mean that women were just so bad at driving when they entered. It just means that Formula One was a very different sport at the time. And sometimes you just couldn't trust your engine to make it all the way to the finish line. And then after these trailblazers, we have what I would call the final three women in Formula One at this time. In 1976, we get Davina Galica. Now, if you look at the years, again, it's right when Lella finished. So there's already a step forward because we didn't have this same big gap that we had between Maria and Lella. Davina was an extremely great athlete because she was a 4-time Olympic skier, and she was actually the captain of her team in 1968 and 1972. Her racing career was actually her second career as an extreme athlete. She started her career when she was invited to a celebrity auto race and actually turned out to be pretty good at it. Ultimately, she then decided to pick up a second career as a race car driver. She started in karting and moved her way up, competing in Formula 2 before ultimately competing in Formula 1. And she raced in Formula 1 in 1976 and 1978. And while she never qualified for a Formula 1 race, I do think there's something so special about her story. Davina was literally a 4-time Olympic skier, got invited to a celebrity race, and was literally talent sourced out of something like this and brought onto a Formula 1 team. The next woman after her was Desiree Wilson in 1980, and while she did fail to qualify for an F1 World Championship Grand Prix, she did become the first woman to ever win a Formula 1 race of any kind at Brands Hatch in 1980. At that time, there was a British Formula 1 championship, which was not the World Championship, and it's now defunct, but she did win that race, which makes her the only woman to have ever won a Formula 1 race of any kind. Now, the most recent woman to enter a Formula 1 Grand Prix was in 1992, and that driver was Giovanna Amati. Now, Giovanna has a very different backstory. She came from a very wealthy family, and in 1978, she was actually kidnapped and held for ransom. She was only 19 years old at the time, and she was held for 2 months before the ransom was paid, and she was released safely. Obviously, just a weird fact that doesn't have anything to do with racing, but does color a little bit about her history. Giovanna began her professional racing career in 1981, and for the 85 to 86 season, she moved up to Italian F3, followed by a stint in Formula 3000, and in 1989, she moved to Japan to race in the Super Formula Series. In 1991, she had her first test in a Formula 1 car, and in 1992, she became the 5th woman to enter a Formula 1 Grand Prix. Giovanna entered 3 Formula 1 Grand Prix, but ultimately failed to qualify for any of them. Her F1 career was over after 1992, but in 1993, she moved over to the Women's European Championship and won, and she continued to race in various sports car series all the way through 1999. But after her last entrance in 1992, we have not seen another woman enter a Formula 1 Grand Prix. The next era of women in Formula 1 that we enter is really what I would refer to as the era of test drivers. The name that you probably know the most when it comes to the history of women in Formula 1, and especially modern women in Formula 1, would be Susie Wolff, because in 2014, she became the first woman to participate in a Formula 1 race weekend since 1992 when Giovanna was there. Susie's path is the one that overlaps the most with current Formula 1 drivers you might know, because she started in karting, she raced in Formula Renault, F3, and DTM, and there are even pictures of her racing alongside Lewis Hamilton. In 2012, Susie was signed as a development driver for Williams, and 2 years later, she participated in a practice session at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, making her the first woman to do so since 1992. In 2015, Susie ultimately retired from motorsport, and her final race was the Race of Champions that year. From this era in the 2000s, Susie is the woman who got the closest to possibly being on a Formula 1 grid. But prior to her becoming a development driver for Williams, there were 2 other women who participated in Formula 1 testing sessions. Sarah Fisher had a demo run in 2002 with McLaren, and Catherine Legge actually had a test run in 2005 for Minardi, and both of those women went on to be great drivers in other series. Catherine Legge is actually currently still driving and had a lot of success in IndyCar. She's entered the Indy 500 multiple times and just ran again this year with the sponsorship of Elf Cosmetics, and she's also had a pretty impressive career in sports car racing. After Susie, we had Carmen Jorda, and she was a test driver for Lotus and Renault from 2015 to 2017, so right behind Susie. So when you look at the generation of women who were attempting to race in Formula 1 from about 1992 all the way up until 2019, something that you'll notice is that there was just not a lot of support for those women. As Formula 1 became more expensive, more intense, and a little bit more like what we recognize Formula 1 to be today, there were less opportunities for women to enter a Grand Prix. And obviously, as the sport developed from what it was in 1950, the ladder became a lot more clear, and the competition on the way there also became a lot more intense. The amount of money being spent was going up and up and up, and none of that money was really going into developing space for women to drive. This sport has always been a bit of a boys' club, but it became more and more difficult for women to break in. Susie ultimately retired because she didn't see a path forward for herself to become a Formula 1 driver. But in 2019, we saw one of the biggest steps forward to getting a path for women into Formula One, and that was the creation of the W Series. Now, the W Series only existed for 3 full seasons. They had a season in 2019, 2021, and 2022, and 2020 was canceled due to what was going on in the world. And the W Series was an all-female single-seater racing championship. What was interesting about this series was that it was free to enter. Something that you may not know about Formula racing is that the steps up until Formula One require a lot of funding from the driver's side. That is also a big part of why we don't see as much diversity in this sport. It is very, very expensive to compete in. Free to enter means that the drivers themselves did not have to front money, which is something that they have to do in other series. And this opened the opportunity for women to compete without having to pay large sums of money for their seat. And while this series only existed for a short period of time, we have seen a number of the women that competed in this series continue on in their racing career. The biggest name that came out of this series was Jamie Chadwick. She won the W Series all 3 years, and from that success, she was invited into the Williams Driver Academy. The W Series also had drivers like Jess Hawkins, who recently became the first woman to test a modern Formula One car for Aston Martin, and Abby Pulling, who you may know from F1 Academy, ultimately was invited into the Alpine Driver Academy after her work in W Series. But there were a lot of reasons why the W Series was criticized. A lot of people saw this akin to segregation, basically taking all of the women who could be potentially really great drivers, putting them in their own series, and expecting them to just stay there. I do think personally there is a lot of good that came out of the W Series, but I think its successor, F1 Academy, has a little bit more poise to be successful, because the goal of F1 Academy, which is happening now, is actually strictly not for women to stay in F1 Academy, but to utilize it to push them into the next stage of Formula racing. When we look at the women who competed in the W Series, Jamie Chadwick and Jess Hawkins are the ones that are most well known for moving forward afterwards. Jamie Chadwick was brought into the Williams Driver Academy, but she also currently drives in Indy Next for Andretti. And this year, she actually won a race, becoming the first woman to do so in Indy Next since 2009. Jamie Chadwick is ultimately a victim of bad timing. I think it's possible that we'll see her be very successful in IndyCar, because there's a real chance that after her success in Indy Next, she will ultimately move up to IndyCar, and hopefully we'll see her be successful there. But it's highly unlikely that we'll see that generation move into Formula One as a whole. And when we look at F1 Academy, this generation of women most likely won't be there either. Susie Wolf, who I talked a little bit about earlier, is actually the woman who runs F1 Academy. This is the second year of the series, and we've actually seen a number of women who were competing in W Series move over to F1 Academy. Bianca Bustamante, Marta Garcia, who won last year's championship, and Abby Pulling, who's really dominating this year. But there have been a couple of changes that have been made to F1 Academy that hopefully will push us towards women moving up the ranks rather than staying in one position. The biggest one of those changes is the fact that women are only allowed to compete in F1 Academy for 2 years. After that, the goal is that they actually move on. Some of the women this year are actually competing in F4 Series simultaneously. We've seen Dorian Pan compete in FRECA, which is also where the champion from last year, Marta Garcia, is currently competing. Abby Pulling has competed with really great success in British F4 this year, and so this year we're seeing a lot of these young women compete in not only F1 Academy, but in mixed grid F4 Series. Ideally, we would see women move out of this series into F3, where right now we only have one woman competing in F3, and that's Sophia Florsch. I think what we're seeing with F1 Academy is a goal towards sustainability. The idea of the W Series was really cool. We saw a lot more young women having the opportunity to compete, and a lot of those women went on to have really great racing careers. But the idea, hopefully, with F1 Academy is twofold. Not only are we seeing these young women get racing experience, we're also seeing a proven market for women in racing. So F1 Academy this year is actually a support series for F1, and so all 7 of their races take place on F1 weekends, and we're seeing crowds show up for them. The races are also simulcast on YouTube and Twitter so that they're free to watch, and we're seeing those viewership numbers go up. And the other thing that we're seeing with F1 Academy this year is something that's really important, and that is sponsorship money. We're seeing brands like Tommy Hilfiger, Pepe Jeans, Charlotte Tilbury, all of these brands who are excited about women and a female audience for racing, sponsor these cars and bring money to this series. Susie Wolf has said that it'll take about 10 to 15 years before we see a woman in Formula One. So most likely all of the women that I talked about in this video will not be that woman, but everyone all the way back to Maria in 1958 will have been a part of laying that groundwork to make it possible for that woman in the future to do so. I do think we'll see a return of women to Formula One, but I also hope that this breakdown made it a little bit clearer about the women that have already participated, and a little bit more understanding as to why we haven't seen women other than Lella Lombardi score points, why some of these women have been so promising but not made it all the way through, and how we're seeing those women who originally were on the grid themselves fighting for a place, working to find a way to get the next generation of women on the grid. So if you want to see women in Formula One, what can you do? First of all, and most importantly, you can put your eyeballs on the screen, whether that's for F1 Academy, whether that is for sports car racing, whether that's for endurance racing, whether that's for Indy Next, whether that's for NASCAR, whatever version of motorsports where women are competing, which is all over the world. You should watch them, and you should also talk about them, because one of the biggest obstacles for women in Formula racing or other motorsports in general is proving that there is an audience for women and that women are worth the money that it costs to develop and drive. Not just the money that it costs to put a single car on track, but the money that has to be invested invested in women and women in racing in general to go from karting all the way up to Formula One. So hopefully this helped you understand a little bit about the rich history in Formula One, the women who have already competed, and the women that we don't talk about enough. As always, thanks for joining me. And if you'd like to hang out with a bunch of people that watch Formula One together, be sure to join the grid chat. The link to that is in the episode description below. I hope you have survived this week without Formula One, and I hope this brief history of women in the sport taught you something you didn't know before. Be sure to subscribe to Grid Chat wherever you're listening, and I will see you next week for the race.